Thank you very much, JP. Yes, just to speak to that point, I have an interest in contradiction, but I'm not interested in the kind of reification of contradiction that often happens in artistic practice, or as an alibi, let's say, for critique. So yeah, just to clarify. I just want to thank JP for the introduction and for the welcome and for everyone organizing this conference. And it's been amazing to listen to everyone's papers over the past few days. It's been also really important, I think, that this conference has laid out perhaps a kind of territory or even a groundwork to navigate some of these relations between the Pittsburgh school and wider forms of pragmatism, even beyond the Pittsburgh school that I was thinking of, that were invoked, and what we think of as Marxist theoretical practice today, which I'd like to try and address in this paper. Part of being an artist is having a practice where one is making things that you then put in the world. And of course, as a writer, we all do that too. Writing is an integral element of my practice. My writing is not, just to clarify, an artwork. I've never said my writing is art. It's certainly not. However, without it, I wouldn't be making my artwork. So it is a part of my world, if you like, as an artist. It's part of my method. And I just want to say something about my kind of approach to this talk in terms of it might not be graced with the word methodology, but it's certainly an approach, which is the whole aim of what I'm trying to do is to navigate the conditions of what putting an artwork in the world can mean politically today, and at the same time thinking about the imbrogation and tensions between different forms of rationality. And in precisely that I mean across, I'm going to deal with today, Althusser and Robert Brandom. In terms of that, what I'm asking you to do, which is quite a lot, like cognitively and affectually, which is a lot to ask you to do, which is to follow me in being able to make heuristic leaps between watching a piece or a short piece of my art practice and maybe trying to think through the parallel between a practice in the world and what I'm actually proposing in my theoretical argumentation, right? Because they're not, my writing is not a proposal for an artwork. It's not the site of the cause of a work. Neither is it the aftermath of analyzing an artwork. It is a parallel condition that does the same kind of job, in my opinion, but by different means. So I'll be asking you to kind of make a cognitive map or a leap across a piece of practice and also what I'm saying without me telling you what the link is. I would assume that's implicit. So I'm not going to do that explication. I'm asking you to do that work. Happy to talk about that afterwards, but I'm not going to give you any answers to that. There's no solution, right? So I'll just be very clear about that from the beginning. So I'm going to start with something quite unusual for me, and someone told me to do this. So I'm following instruction from someone's opinion. I'm going to start by showing you an excerpt of a work that I made recently. Now, for some of you who came yesterday and watched the majority of this work, I thank you so much for spending your time when you have a full schedule. But I know some of you didn't see this piece, and just for those who didn't, I'm just going to show you a tiny little excerpt just to give you an indication of the kind of stuff I'm doing as an artist. Then I'm going to read a paper. I'm going to read a paper to stay on time, because it's schematic, but it's got some dense parts, and I just want to make sure we have enough time for conversation or even reflection on the wider conditions of this debate, right, together, after many of us have contributed to it over the past 3 days, and to acknowledge your contribution as well. So normally, like I say, normally what I do is I'll do some theory, and then I'll go, oh, so here's some artwork at the end. But I thought, here we go. On someone's advice, I thought, here, I'll show you some artwork, and you've got time to then digest that a bit, and then we'll see what happens. So Map of the Bomb is a 5-channel video installation. It was made in 2022. It took quite a long time to make, mainly due to COVID. It was a commission from Fieldwork Marfa in Texas, and it was filmed in Beirut, Los Angeles, and Texas, Marfa in Texas. And again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to read a little précis of the work, show you, say, 5 minutes, and then we'll do the paper. So this is kind of this is what I tell myself it's about when I'm trying to make sense of my work, okay? So this work analyzes how transcendental thought lands in the political through a feminist invention of subterranean technologies. It concentrates on the story of Viennese actress Hedy Lamarr and her work with Georges Antheil. Georges Antheil famously wrote Le Ballet Mécanique, a piece for multiple player pianos, automated music. And they together hung out together in Los Angeles when she's filming, hung out off set. They developed what we know to be spread spectrum frequency hopping. I'm sure many of you have heard about this now because there was a documentary about Hedy Lamarr that came out after I'd made this film, which kind of was good and annoying as well. Basically, this was an invention that happened in the music studio. So this was my first attraction to this idea. It was developed in a studio practice. It was from music that this technological invention occurred. And this invention was for an unhackable encryption device used in the Second World War for submarine communication. And it's what was later developed to give us cell phone technology and Wi-Fi today. So I'll give you a very quick, really, if someone knows about this, you'll get really annoyed with me because this is such a layman's version of how this works. JP, say if you're, I give you a set of frequencies to tune into, and I tell you what frequencies they are, and I have the same frequencies, then we jump at the same time, and we can talk together without any interruption, but if you're listening, you will not hear, you'll just hear noise. You'll be just hearing noise-based frequencies, but we'll be talking, right? They invented it by playing on the piano at different octaves at the same time. So they were hopping together. That's how it came out of the music studio. So that was really, again, that just to reinforce the idea, it's really important about how something comes out of a practice that is known as a humanities creative practice, leads to these inventions that not only created this encryption, but also led to a revolution in communications as we know it today, where there's no going back. So Lamarr is the atypical noir feminine protagonist. She's alienated by, but author of this unreal nature, this technology. She evidences the paradox of her invention. On the one hand, this is an exclusive system of communication where anyone that holds the code to how this language works can use it. And so its job is to prevent access from anyone else listening. On the other hand, when this system is globalized, we can say anything to each other. We can just all talk together, like the pluralism of the web. But we find ourselves in this space of semantic pessimism, where nothing seems to matter because we've got no access to the infrastructure of the system itself. So this inaccess to truth that we find in our kind of free-form, globalized network of communications demonstrates how the exclusive conditions of the original invention are imminent to the open claims of the latter. So in this work, I'm exploring Hedy Lamarr's encryption device as an alien or non-standard system of communication. And these systems are naturalist in that they produce an abstraction of reality that defines a way of being, and they're technical in that they act as operational infrastructures for our intersubjective mediations. These systems do not produce fixed metaphysical figurations of how reality really is, but rather are the vector through which reality unfolds. In this way, they demonstrate the tensions and the homology between meaning and use and between transcendental and empirical scales. So this is like the kind of background or the interest that we're all hovering around when I made this piece. There's so many more aspects to this piece that are ranging from the metaphysical to the kitsch and the collapse of the two. But I'm going to show you just a few minutes. For those of you who hasn't seen it, it's just like the first bits of this piece. And this is a single channel version because there's no way I could show you the 5-channel in this context. Okay.
What is it to know the division between mind and world, to live across it? This is a story of knowing how unknowns play out, play a part in a system, and how I manipulate them. But the language that we use to explain these factors remains distinct from its causes. Reasons become the effects of revolution. These systems engineer and feed our need for popular, natural, and unpredictable events. The patterns call us. They register only at the level of noise and abstraction. It is another language that we have yet to understand as a language. It says this: worlds are made. Worlds can be destroyed. We make patterns. I know it was all meant to be. You never had any choice. You want to reason the cause of revolution? My trajectory encapsulates two things at once: the explosive decision inside, vertigo. The bomb is my head. This is a map of the bomb.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. And if anybody does want to see the video, you can just email me, because I can send you a Vimeo link if you wanted to watch it. But I'll leave it there for now. I hope that just gives a little sense of the kind of construction of the piece. And now I'm going to sit down because it's just much easier to read. So the paper that I've prepared today is asking what is art doing when it's saying how things are. And this reflects on my long-term interest in producing a kind of claim for a new realism in art. So Louis Althusser's Marxism and Robert Brandom's pragmatism invest in the labor of a scientific rationality that must explicate what we are doing when we are saying what reality is. When making things explicit holds implicit commitments that it cannot explicate, and critique holds not only the crisis that it is bonded to the object that it negates, but that it actually creates and or overdetermines this object, we can ask, how do these pictures respond to these conditions? So this is a question of picturing for me. Do we need a kind of pragmatism to prevent the crisis of critical solipsism? And do we need a critique to determine the ambitions of explication? And in all of this, since we're talking about a form of scientific image, do we see a role for art in this project at all? For Althusser, what is implicit and therefore needs to be pulled out at the root, as he says, is the insidious infrastructure of the ideological state apparatus at work in capitalism, a system that throws the means of our analysis, such as logic, metaphysics, and empiricism, into crisis. Here, the real abstractions of capital not only subtend all that is said and done, but assimilate the very principle of transcendence to itself as a value for more accumulation and expansion. This disorienting space of capital is, as we know, a relation between relations, whereas Althusser has famously written, in ideology, men do indeed express not the relation between them and their conditions of existence, but the way they live the relation between them and their conditions of existence. This presupposes both a real relation and an imaginary lived relation. And I know many of you have heard and read that so many times, but I just thought it's worth saying again. So in response to this disarray, Althusser does not give up on saying something about the state of the human within a social reality that is defined by capital. Despite his well-known suspicion of culture, he has some ideas about how artworks have a role as either catalysts for the self-conscious recognition of reality, or that they are capable of manifesting this consciousness themselves. In terms of the latter, this idea of an artwork that manifests consciousness on its own terms, he calls upon new techniques of abstract picturing that not only grasp, quote, the determinations of absence that govern us, end quote, but also in doing so denature ideology. So this phrase, determinate absence that governs us, I'm going to come back to a lot in this paper. And I want to because it not only describes the subjugation of capitalist alienation, but it also invokes the transhistorical subjectlessness of the human, something that the last panel actually I was in was talking about quite coherently. But what is key to Althusser's politics of negation is that this implication of something other than capitalist abstraction cannot play in the game of the political. It cannot play out in the space of how things are. In this sense, this determination of absence, when read as a description of capital, is shot through with pessimism and despair. For it informs us that there can be no subject after it. At the same time, taking this idea of determinate absence as a reference to some aleatory form of absence, this gesture to the transhistorical subjectlessness, this image lands in the language of theology because the thought of the future, like subjectivity, is the sole property of capital. As such, these images of consciousness are not images of hope and an imaginable future, but instead are manifestations of and injunctions for negation. They're kind of prompts for the act of negating and abolishing the conditions of the all of capital. So they have this kind of pedagogical quality, at best, you could say. So they tell a truth that must be recognized, that idealist absolutes of autonomy and progress must be abolished. This is an education that the future must be negated, and so must a subject that thinks it. So, in between saying and doing, Robert Brandom identifies what he calls pragmatic meta-vocabularies, or PMVs, and for him, they're the implicit acts that construct relations. These forms of implicit know-hows subtend meaning-making. They're techniques that allow us to connect different vocabularies. For Brandom, the task of explicating what we are doing when we say what reality is requires a meta-vocabulary that explicates the givenness of these pragmatic means. He, like Althusser, needs a new method that manifests more than just another action that repeats or a recognition that justifies what it describes as already happening. This, Brandom says, quote, is neither metaphysics nor an attempt to construct a universal pragmatic meta-vocabulary, Rather, I am looking for a different kind of meta-vocabulary. It is a higher level, making it possible to express crucial structural features of the relations between the dimensions of discursiveness they take as their targets, relations between what is said and what is done. Okay, so when we look at Althusser's critique of ideology and then Brandom's explication, his desire to explicate PMVs, both take certain conditions as given, meaning that their skepticism, either of them, despite what we'd say, however paranoid Althusser might seem, their skepticism doesn't go all the way down. And I think that's kind of important. And kind of just to give you an example of the kind of depth or level of Althusser's skepticism, I'll give you one example, which is in this very short essay, A Letter on Art, a reply to André Dasbre. Althusser takes the illusory and uneven ground that is subjective idealism, that which is characterized as bourgeois autonomy, as a raw form of unconscious material. He uses the example of the modern realist novel in this essay, where because art is bathed in ideology, it can make us see, perceive, but not know something that alludes to reality. Althusser leverages the fact that we may live in a second-degree ideology, but we behave according to ideology of the first degree. Basically, we're slavishly instructed to subjective idealism. This mimetic act of an illusory mind-world relation acts as a useful cause to generate the dissolution of the all that is given in capitalist reality. So it's the unconscious consciousness of the modern subject that produces a confrontation with the illusion that produces us. Whilst this is a description of modern realism, and he uses like Balzac and Tolstoy to talk about this, we will also see in a little while that another way forward for Althusser is developed through different kinds of art, where art can manifest a revolutionary consciousness, which is a form of scientificity that is activated, let's say, to use that Salasian term, within the form of the manifest image. So this distinction between modern realism and this form of critical consciousness shows how, on the one hand, Althusser ontologizes the subject of capital because there are no other means of access to the subject but through the real abstraction that is capital itself. And on the other hand, it is because this subject is uneven and ideologically constituted, namely transhistorical and subjectless, that it can be educated differently so as to achieve this future revolutionary mode of apprehension, right? So that's kind of like these two forms of like Althusser's view of art, and I'm going to like expand upon this version of revolutionary consciousness in a little while, right? So that's going to be a little focus. But for Brandom, I think it's as if, when I read Brandom, it's as if we're already living in the scene after Althusser's desired epistemological break. So in the 2019 book, The Spirit of Trust, Brandom's use of the term the postmodern, which he qualifies as the age of trust, argues that self-consciousness was implicit all along, implicit in the sacral character of the pre-modern era and internal to the heroic identity of humanist rationalism of the Enlightenment modernity. In the postmodern space of reasons, we can self-consciously assert that we are the architects of the norms that we are bound to. This subtends a pluralist form of metaphysics, a project that has to be continually revised with respect to the materials that it critiques. New vocabularies may come along that have not been considered, and so we have to be prepared to be unprepared in these instances. He says, quote, "It is perhaps a little quixotic. It is crucial that it's pursued in the open-minded, pluralistic spirit of Lewis and not in an exclusionary one," end quote. So this view not only resists the theological and kitsch abstractions that Althusser's ideology critique solicits, but also avoids the kind of Platonic skepticism which Hegel framed as, quote, the art of dissolving all that is determinate and showing it in its nullity, end quote. It also prosecutes the kind of semantic pessimism that permeates Althusser's critique. But at the same time, we can ask if this liberal-minded, pragmatic form of metaphysics should be tackling the question of the finitude of capitalism that Althusser demands, the question of the roots of the system that norms take place within, as well as this account of how an emergence of such norm recognition could be established against the conventions that define capitalism. I mean, just for example, how far do the principles that order the commitment to having this open mind cohere with the same desires of capital? And so, although we see the possibility that concrete imaginaries can be separated from concerns about the ideology of class relations, it's hard to see how this theory can intervene in the politics of the exchange abstraction that defines capitalism, that is our lived and imagined experience that we are in now. So it's clear that both Althusser and Brandom want to guard any project against forms of supernaturalism. They do not want a politics of the difference of indifference. So, for example, in the 2010 book Between Saying and Doing, Brandom critiques the problem of the base. This is where, quote, different species of naturalism, end quote, are erroneously taken to be non-inferential bases for future judgments, or are taken, quote, as reasons for other judgments, end quote. And whilst Althusser can be seen to be guilty of the latter, precisely in the example I've just given about modernist realism, where he kind of like naturalizes the bourgeois subject as a means to cause the rupture in ideology, it's Althusser that gives us I'm sure everybody knows, this searing critique of the spirit of history, where he talks about, he uses Marx's critique of the mystical shell of the dialectic and Hegel's idealism. So, just for example, in the text Contradiction and Overdetermination, Althusser describes this problem of history as where the reduction of all the elements that make up the concrete life of a historical epoch, economic, social, political, and legal institutions, customs, ethics, art, religion, philosophy, and even historical events, wars, battles, defeats, and so on, to one principle of internal unity is itself only possible on the absolute condition of taking the whole concrete life of a people for the externalization, alienation of an internal spiritual principle, which can never definitely be anything but the most abstract form of that epoch's consciousness of itself, its religious or philosophical consciousness, that is, its own ideology. So it's here where I've tried to kind of map some of the givens that subtend Althusser's and Brandom's project, where I'd like to follow Althusser's view of pursue this question of a revolutionary consciousness, and also kind of give a bit more space for Brandom's investment in explication. To kind of push this question, if it's possible to ask about dialectics in terms of what Althusser talked about, the necessity to transform its structures, and how these practices present different attitudes and processes of negation that each hold within critique and explication, like exclusively, like critique, Althusser, explication, Brandom. So in asking about this transformation of dialectical systems, it's a question regarding the political traction that's possible by images that can claim a science. I want to target the question of the horizon of intelligibility, the possibility for expanding what reason is and can be, and the core investment of Brandom's Hegelianism and Althusser's Marxism. So in a more general sense, we can ask if these rational and critical aspirations are fit for purpose, or whether they are just nostalgic in a world today that is labored in the affectual delegitimization of truth and science. In keeping with many philosophers, this question can help us to understand what parameters and scope there are for scientific statements that extend beyond the conventions that reason has domesticated for and to itself, a problem that Althusser qualifies as this fall into idealism or the spontaneous philosophy of the scientists, and which in different terms Danielle Macbeth has characterized as the error of mistaking the premises for the rules. Given this, can pictures that explicate what we are doing when we are positing a scientific image of what reality is put pressure on the politics of the reason that it labors for? What techniques of abstraction are invented in these very attempts? And I just want to say, it's really clear to me, I mean, no matter where I go in terms of where I'm talking about these issues, whether it's an art context or a philosophy context or any other place, it's rare that we ask if art can constitute such pictures. Not many people are interested in this. And I'm sure many of you, who are very kindly sitting here today listening to me talk and talking about art are going, what's art got to do with this? It's bullshit, right? So I kind of understand why you might be saying that, because I might be saying that too when I look at the field of art today. But obviously I'm kind of optimistic about some things. So I just want to say I kind of sympathize with this position, this blah, what we're doing talking about art. But at the same time, I think it's vital that we do. And because, I'm just kind of going off script here for a second, because if we don't attend to what art is doing, then we're forgetting just how pervasive the culture of art is in reproducing the principles of capitalism behind our backs. And even though we might ignore art and not want to go and look at any or talk about it or have anything to do with it, it's still doing that in culture at large. So to avoid or omit it from your horizon would be a dreadful error, I think, in terms of your political apprehension. So, I want to just say that, just like me being critical of art has a tradition of doing this too. And it came to its kind of apotheosis in the moment of postmodern trauma, let's call it. In this phase, art acknowledged that it was engulfed with problems that include the overdetermination of epistemic insufficiency for impossibility and the naturalization of the crisis of critique as the base vocabulary and fate of all its work. So the problem here is that art as explication, the act of bringing what is implicit to be seen, has subsided with critique, whose skepticism is thoroughly in league with what Hegel recognized as the presuppositionless skepticism of classicism that destroys its object. So art's loves its own suicide and perpetuates that. I'm sure you're very familiar with this motif. So in mid to late 20th century, conceptual art, we see this reach its primary expression, where art became a project of explication that explicates itself as a farcical form of consciousness, a place where critique endlessly rehearses its own death. As artistic content defines itself as a methodological abstraction, it vitiates critique against any transformative possibilities. This naturalization of transcendence holds out the further problem of art's false humility, in that it takes its own assertion that all consciousness is false way too seriously. And so it posits its own falsity as its own truth, and then loves that contradiction, as we were just referring to at the beginning. So in this paradigm, art fails to extract pragmatism or ideology critique, no matter which phase you could say art sides with, where analytical conceptual art sided with pragmatism, you could say, and then you could look at other forms of art that sided with ideology critique. Both enjoy being subtended by or falling into forms of classical romanticism, making pragmatism a form of pluralized subjective idealism and Marxism a form of theology. Okay, so that's my problem with art in a nutshell. So now I want to talk about Althusser's version of revolutionary consciousness in art. And many of you know there's a very famous text he wrote on the artist Cremonini. It was called Cremonini, Painter of the Abstract. So I want to talk about this 1966 text. Althusser proposes that art can develop a picture of consciousness that does not cultivate the naive form of false consciousness of bourgeois autonomy, nor does it reflects upon the Hegelian idealism of historical progress. This kind of consciousness is analogous to what Brandom refers to as the postmodern recognition of our bonds to each other, which is for him the basis of community. But what for Brandom is a spirit of trust, for Althusser, these bonds are forms of bondage that must be broken in a new spirit of critique. For Althusser, Leonardo Cremonini's art holds the cognitive resources of a revolutionary dialectical materialism. Cremonini paints the complex of real abstraction. Althusser adopts Cremonini's literal depiction of mirrors in one of his works as the ultimate metaphor for the metaphysical thrust of this new realism. And I've got some images of Cremonini, if we could. I mean, I'm so a non-art historian, I rarely take images to talks, but I just thought you might want to just see Cremonini's work. So I just brought along some pictures to, thank you, and to go through them, do I?
Yeah.
Do I just click? Oh, okay.
Make sure that it's this.
Oh, okay,
this one, yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm just gonna it doesn't really matter which one I'm, focusing on, because it is a general statement that Althusser is making, but,
Oh, if you want to play the back.
Sorry.
It's all right, we'll just use the back arrow.
Oh, great.
That's the back.
I didn't realize. Okay, so we'll just leave it on that one, but we can look again if you want to in a bit. So, where were we? So yeah, this is the ultimate metaphor for the metaphysical thrust of this new realism. So the artist now cuts the smoothness of the undifferentiated image space of capital in two. The mirrors inside the painting show people looking at themselves in, quote, the old mirrors of ordinary homes, the mirrors of shabby 1900 wardrobes, and men at grips with their only wealth, the wretched past in which they look at themselves, says Althusser. He also says they are restoring to them their only inalienable possession, their own image, end quote. He calls these mirrors blind. He says, these blind mirrors see them and draw out the inexorable circle which dominates the connections between men, end quote. This is the law of perpetual, endless self-reference. This kind of figuration exceeds aesthetic verisimilitude, but what is key to this interpretation from Althusser is that Cremonini depicts these mirrors against the presence of great verticals, partitions and walls, as we can see here. These juxtapositions, as Althusser asserts, quote, depict something other than the circle of ideological existence, the determination of the circle by its difference, by a different non-circular structure, by a law of a quite different nature, a weight which is irreducible to any genesis and haunts all of Cremonini's later canvases in its determinate absence, end quote. So the term genesis here is really important, and it goes back to that kind of critique of Hegel that I read out, that long quote from Overdetermination and Contradiction. So the term genesis here indexes Althusser's critique of Hegelian idealism. It is this mystical shell that produces a second implicit mirror. It doubles a subjective idealism that is cultivated by capitalism. The claim is that this methodology of picturing abstraction that Cremonini produces performs a break from the unconscious forms of consciousness that characterize subjective idealism, and it delineates the possibility of another law that posits the refusal to identify with the idealism of Hegelian becoming. It's like a double negation is occurring in this space. This description presents art as an ally to Althusser's account of, quote, a theory of practice in general, itself elaborated on the basis of the theory of existing theoretical practices of the sciences, which transforms into knowledges, scientific truths, the ideological product of existing empirical practices, the concrete activity of men. This is the materialist dialectic, which is none other than dialectical materialism, end quote. So the technique of a negatively oriented meta-vocabulary, an intervention in the implicit relations between categories of meaning and use is what is being proposed by this very act of making a piece of art. And that interests me as an artist, right? So, right, it's quite clear. As someone that doesn't write about art, I have to say, I've got to give Althusser a bit of leg room to say all this about a piece of work. Because I'm like going, I just am like, what poetry are we looking at here, Althusser, So I am like always skeptical of people reading artworks off in these ways. However, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and go, okay, let's just say that this is like operational, this idea that's going on in this work. If I take it seriously, I'm going to say that there's two problems, first of all, with this idea. So even however much I might like this, I might, oh yeah, art gets to participate in the project of scientific rationality and gets to be part of a Marxian project. Yay, I love art to do that. But there's two problems, first of all. So the first one is, if we read all this as a revolutionary break, the figuration of absence made by this abstraction may sever us from the ideology of capital and philosophical idealism, but the cost is that it establishes its practice as a theoretical and symbolic practice that cannot assert itself in the political, something that Brandom might accuse of theoretical quietism or something like that. So the claim for this picturing also holds the contradiction that on the one hand, we are told that an epistemic break comes before this picturing. Like one needs a revolutionary consciousness to make the picture. And then, so this idea of the picture itself is a product of a revolutionary consciousness. And yet on the other hand, this knowledge is given as what John Roberts might qualify as the suspensive form. Even though for Roberts, this is a positive reading of art's political claim, in this reading, it suggests the problem that art's theoretical practice cannot actually intervene in and after the practices that constitute material reality. One reason for this is because this type of methodological abstraction cannot perform any sort of self-reflexivity to test its own dogmatism. The act becomes a categorical conceptual form from which other descriptions spring, and these descriptions could be problematically constrained to the same limits that it entails. So what I'm kind of saying in a nutshell is that it might make the mistake by being the painter of abstraction of overdetermining capital as an abstract form as opposed to the complex of processes that we know it is, like the relations that Althusser actually describes. So that could be a problem here, and especially the suspensive form problem. So the second problem is something that Herbert Marcuse could help me out with, which is in the text, the concept of negation in the dialectic. Marcuse critiques Althusser's view that Marx broke with the Hegelian dialectic. Marcuse argues that the Marxian tendency for progress could not be destroyed where, quote, even the materialist dialectic remains under the influence of the positivity of idealist reason, where the future is always deeply rooted in the present, end quote. Dialectics require that a new system must emerge from within an existing system, and Althusser's theory confronts this possibility as the limit itself. For Marcuse, this limit is ultimately recapitulated in the negation that dialectics performs. As such, the philosophical idealism of progress that is latent in dialectics is just as present in negative dialectics. The fact that Marxism could not produce a radical transformation of history brings Althusser's project to crisis again. By this reading, what this dialectic produces is therefore perhaps only distinct from how Althusser describes modern realism in a formal sense. So everything he said about bourgeois subjectivity being like a form of false consciousness that cannot, this based in ideology, we might end up just in a new form of semantic arrangement, but effectively the same processes are at work that he hasn't got out of the problem of modern realism. And so this is where we see the contradiction that the subjective critique that characterizes this work gives no room for a species of society for and in itself. It presents no resources for difference that are within the grasp of this subjectivity. So for Marcuse, this presents, quote, the very concrete problem in view of the question of whether and to what extent advanced technological societies in the West can at least serve as models for constructing a new society based on technological development of the productive forces, end quote. So just to sum up these two problems, these descriptions make a distinction between taking this artwork, one, as a conscious but suspensive form, or two, as unconscious and as unconscious and yet political. So it's unconscious but takes part in the political. So, and then finally, a third problem here is that Cremonini's work might be seen to entail and determine the types of conclusions that were made in the expressivist traumas of postmodern self-conscious art that I described earlier. So this is where we see the mirror function of subjective idealism collapse with the principle of history as the mystical shell of idealism. This postmodern art, so involved in the question of what it is, explicates its own failure to make the distinction that Brandom is keen to hold for his version of the postmodern that asks us about what we are doing. And for him, Brandom, this demands a demarcation, as we know, between the explanandum, that which is to be explained, and the explanans, the argument that rationalizes the former. Without this distinction, we trivially energize the semantic possibilities of false consciousness, and by doing so, neutralize any project that could reorganize the principles of its own labor. So, what I'm kind of saying is we get, number one, the suspensive form, the self-subtraction from the political, which is precisely the opposite of what Althusser is looking for in terms of theoretical practice. Number two, we just get the reformulation of false consciousness and bourgeois subjectivity. And number three, we get the kind of dreaded postmodern trauma of the 1980s, which I think we're still in today to a large extent, in terms of the artistic paradigms I'm talking about here. So we've introduced the problem that Althusser does not offer a theory of a subject that extends beyond a capitalist framework. But we have also seen the same issues with Brandom, where the space of reasons as the bond of the social becomes defined by a very Americanized identity of politics and life. This is a life as jurisprudence, a primarily legalistic institution. In these ways, Brandom's work could be seen to restage the same problems that we identify in Althusser's example of a critical form of self-consciousness, where, on the one hand, explication may not go deep enough to exit the reducibility of the spirit of trust to the spirit of capital, and on the other hand, the image of consciousness that is a fictional form of a suspensive state in Cremonini's paintings. When you look at Brandom, this kind of could be mapped onto a material political practice whose suspensive state is not like a withdrawal from the political, but it actually is a withdrawal in terms of geopolitical terms, like a withdrawal that we see, the withdrawal from America from NATO, the very territory of being American, a bordered political space of trust that is only fit for the few who can act in these ways. And I have to say, after living in America for 12 years, I definitely see this difference, right? This liberal-minded world, which is very different from living in England. So Althusser's resistance against and Brandom's commitment to the matter of the ought, I think, produced two forms of fantasy. One which suspends the future of reason, and the other which imagines the actual existence of an operative liberal democracy, both, for me, certain forms of fantasy. And so finally, what I want to look at, and just to kind of bring all this together, hopefully, is something about determination or negative determination and impossibility. So Althusser follows the Marxian idea that what is to be known and its solution already exist, whilst at the same time we're asked to confront the limit of both of these factors. We have seen how this focus on the limit of knowing has been bonded to the limit of capital. We have read his notion of abstraction as a naive continuation of the idealist history he refuses, and we have seen how art as a form of suspensive symbolism that cannot enter the terrain of political practice becomes a convention that legislates other future acts. But these assertions are made by focusing on the relations held within the picture, especially the production of the absence that is disclosed in these relations inside the picture. So these views tend to forgo the question of the whole frame of the picture, and how the picture is posited in the world itself. So this brings us not only to consider the abstraction that the painting paints and produces, but the act of painting itself is another act of abstraction. The question of these two states of abstraction can be seen in what Marcuse refers to as, quote, two central dialectical concepts, the negation of the negation as the internal development of an antagonistic social whole, and the concept of the whole whereby each individual position finds its value and truth, end quote. And it's like maybe something like this where I can see another track that is held within the gesture to impossibility that Althusser demands, and which speaks to the question of the distinction between what Marcuse calls the totality and the whole, the necessity to think what is outside, but not in terms of the theological identity of impossibility. So here for Marcuse, quote, every determinate social whole must be part of a greater social totality. This greater totality itself must again be a concrete social totality, end quote. So to think this through, I want to look at how Althusser's invocation of finitude can be assisted by both Brandom's Hegelian pragmatism of determinate negation and his dialectics of meaning and use as being categories internal to and homologous between techniques of explication and acts of implication. So I'm going to go through just a couple of examples of impossibility, this like hitting the limit in Althusser, to try and like think about it as a non-theological state, because it's easily read off as theological, right? So I want to try and like deal with that problem. So Althusser's 1978 essay, The What in What Is to Be Done, which focuses on the striking workers at the Alfa Romeo car factory in Portello, Italy between 71 and 72, describes the politics of the impossible question. The workers have understood the bonds of their oppression and how they contribute to this, namely, they buy the car that they make. But getting out of this paradigm is not possible for what comes after this consciousness. And further, if this consciousness remains local, how can the images that it adopts to understand itself by be scaled and mediated for other workers in other conditions? So this essay is all about this question of different scales, both geopolitically and abstract scales. So this is, and Althusser says, this is where the impossible question must be posed, one that cannot be answered by the workers or the ruling class. This is the simple and enigmatic question, why the car? Why automobiles for workers? But here, impossibility is not something in itself. It is a question that arises in understanding what reality is in its very particular empirical and abstract circumstances. So I'm really interested in like the arrival of this impossible question. And so I want to also talk about another example. The quality of this question begging is framed in similar terms in Althusser's text, The Myth of the State of Nature. And in this text, the quality of such question begging is described as an act of omnipotent abstraction in the story of Genesis. This is where Eve's transgression of asking the big metaphysical question pitches the real aleatory against the pseudo-omnipotence of God himself. A world is created by this question, a world that Eve is part of. This description follows the distinction that Hegel articulated in the division between presuppositionless skepticism, that is the destruction of philosophy, to dogmatism, where critique destroys the object and itself, and a modern form that arises after the death of the object. So would this be critique or a world that only needs explication? Because something continues after this death, right? Like God's secularized, if you like, or disposed of his power, but a world comes after this question. So I want to think about that kind of bridge and the new era of history in this context that demands to be imagined and reasoned. So Brandom's definition of determinate negation, where reason decides when something new will present itself. When I think about that and Marcuse's critique together, it kind of reminds me that the dissonance that Althusser frames as determinate absence, or the production of this omnipotent gesture, is not a confrontation with this like radical nothing in a theological sense. It's an inference to something that is held within the practical development of the question itself, that does some work in constructing the possibility of this future image. In that sense, it seems pragmatic to focus on the question of what is determined in the asking of the question, in the kind of determinate negation that the question implies. And this kind of goes back to a lot of my interest in rhetoric and the kind of persuasive, compelling speech act. And I'm not saying that the question holds within itself its own answer, like it's fully answering itself. So it's not like a determined answer is posed by asking the question, but certainly there is an answer that is held within the inference inside the question. So reading off the impossible question in this pragmatic light calls upon the material conditions of predecessors, reasons, and the state of inference as a formation for modal vocabularies to play out within the frame of critique and explication. This leans into Althusser's own suggestion, where the worker's knowledge about their situation is unequal to what they know more, and they know less than what they know. But when framed in the paradigm of consciousness and knowledge for Althusser, we can see that for Brandom, a similar sentiment is framed in the paradigm of doings. This is where for Brandom, quote, one has always done more, both more or less than what one ought. So I'm kind of interested in this description of knowing in Althusser and this question of doing in Brandom, where these knowings and doings, I would say both need to be thought through, not just knowings or doings, but both need to be thought through in the world. And together, when we think about that, they exceed the standpoint of the perspective of one who is doing the knowing and knowing the doing, etc. So I'm really interested in that space of thinking. So in light of all this, I want to just sum up these points. What I'm trying to do is ask how art could ask its own impossible questions that focus on what we are doing with art. I'll give you an example, why representation? Why painting? I want to ask these really simple questions without over-determining this question back to the question of what is art. As I've said, the question of what is art is what is driven the kind of trauma of this postmodern problem that I've been trying to talk about as being problematically romantic. The second point I want to make is the different abstractions that are produced between the method by which we work and what is the object or target of our focus each hold the dialectics of meaning and use within them. They also hold their own dialectical relation. This view takes up Brandom's critique of pragmatism's reduction of vocabularies to use and the aim to expand the analytical project to what he calls matters of the relations between meanings and use in all their instances, at all their levels. And the third thing I want to say is that determinate negation is part of the process that generates the impossible question. And this produces modal vocabularies, abstractions that are unmoored from their premises. At the same time, the predecessors and ideologies that determine the choices that are made possible in any circumstance of determinate negation can be explicated and subjected to critique. In the same way, art can determine by negation the inferences that it itself produces and explicate them within the same frame. So this is the affordance of art. This is the privilege that art has to do so. So in other words, the act that we might think of as being implicit can be acted out in a piece of work. And in the same frame, one can return to that same piece at a different temporality to explicate the inferences that are already in that piece in the same frame, right? So that's the kind of luxury, let's say, we have in the space of art. So by taking negation as a methodological structure and not as an imageless act, we can examine what we are doing when we claim to inscribe a determination for another way of being. So in this argument, I've aimed to show how art holds the possibility that in the same space, multiple operations are taking place. This opposes art as the production of one dialectical system that is proposed by Althusser's work on Cremonini, and it also opposes the nihilism of art as a postmodern trauma that seems implicated in this very design. In Cremonini's work, I kind of think it holds that problem. In this sense, the apparently irreconcilable condition between critique and pragmatism should not end in equating consciousness with stultifying forms of romanticism, which, as I've argued, has become art's prime categorical conceptualization. So just to say that, what I'm trying to say is that in the attempts to kind of unify kind of pragmatic critique with Marxian projects, in the art world, the answer's usually been, shit, you can't, it's a trauma, you'll end up in romanticism, in the very project of doing what we're trying to do in this conference. That's where you'll end up. Like, the art's told us that historically. And I'm saying, well, maybe not. Let's hope not. So I want to consider a kind of dissonant or abstract determinism as a practice of transcendental materialism, where we explore and test what is impossible for capital and what is possible for us. The very myth of autonomy that is granted to art by the same excoriating class divisions that we have critiqued has often been seen as some unsurpassable irony. But at the same time, art can revise its norms and ideals to craft its presence in the political, not by such givens, but rather by staking its claim as a disciplinary modality that is capable of what Althusser calls, in Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists, real interdisciplinarity. Such images might be described, as Johannes Siept has put it, as projective metaphysics. And this finally raises the question, just as an afterthought, of what possible or even transformative conceptual categories art can develop in this projection. Siept is interested in how, for Sellers, picturing statements are object language statements, end quote. Being situated by existing conceptual schemes, these statements, quote, can be taken to articulate a perspectival description of extra-linguistic reality, end quote. This double orientation reflects on the synoptic vision that Sellers produces, but also shores up the dissonance in doing and knowing that is captured between Althusser and Brandom. Siep's metaphysics, quote, bestows reality or representability upon categorical structures gained by category projection, end quote, which suggests that the inferences that emerge from these commitments, and I'm calling these commitments these impossible questions, are not simply the act of further implicating the same norms by different means in fetishistic transpositions. So I'm hoping that these ideas may offer certain forms of intelligibility, but often, as we have seen, they rarely do. They rarely do more than bind us to capital further. Implicit, then, to all of this talk is the question of how deep our skepticism should go, and how we kind of even monitor this relation, like how do we even know when we might think our skepticism has a certain pathological dimension. If we want to suggest some cohesion between transhistorical subjectlessness and the capacity for us to render new normative frameworks, then can this follow what Ernst Bloch's claim that thinking means venturing beyond, and occur without, as Donald Davidson says, quote, an appeal to conventions? And I think this kind of tension, this question, is just one that will help us develop a method towards thinking such real projections that I'm trying to achieve here. So thank you so much for listening.
Well, thanks, Amanda. That was enlightening and entertaining, which I think is very good in a Marxism and the Pittsburgh School conference at the end. I'm interested. I mean, I really enjoyed your bit about having a kind of smile at Althusser's attempts to interpret the content of the painting and to assign to it certain kind of characteristics that are questionable, shall we say. But I just wondered if you could say something about, it's one of the things, as also somebody who's in a kind of creative discipline, architecture in my case, that the constant problem is, if you like, the relationship between the content of the work, but your position as a producer within the chain of capitalist production, and you know, and it's so overt these days, particularly in the art world, which has been entirely subsumed. You know, so that the greatest act of commodification in art these days is to be radical, because it you know, that's going to have the greatest value. And I just wondered if you would reflect a little bit on the relationship between, you know, you can perhaps talk about your own work or talk about something else, but between that content of the artwork and the if you like to use a Salasian phrase, the function that the artwork plays in the wider matrix of capitalism.
Yeah, that's so important, obviously. And, you know, when I began, you know, I tried to kind of like maybe infer that, you know, what is a theoretical practice? And, you know, I consider my work and other people's work a theoretical practice. And I don't mean that as in like it's theory, but I mean that it's like a set of concepts and ideas that are manifest in particular, in complex picturing, clusters of picturing that then is put in the world. And I think what your question is really making me think of is, well, what is that putting it in the world? And when, you know, and of course the world it's made within, even in the studio, of course, is, you know, completely imbricated within all of these problems as well, right? And so are we, our psychology. And so, I mean, that goes back to like Althusser's based in ideology moment where there's no outside. And that's why, in many ways, his idea of art's capacity to have, or to aspire even to what he would call a revolutionary consciousness. And for me, I would think of it more in terms of, let's say, scientificity is really vital. And for art to craft its constant understanding of what that can be for itself, but also in relation to other disciplines. Hitherto, you know, what we've had in art is either, when we talk about how art takes place in the political, it's often supported and advocated by funders of art and artists alike who think that it's just really good to work with other people. You know, this idea of interdisciplinarity as a liberal problem, and Althusser writes about this in SBS like really well, and talks about the false idea of the liberal dogmatism of being forced to work together for the name of like the good and stuff. But what is it to join together under a commitment and to recognize a similar commitment across disciplines or within a discipline, and to work together in the ways that we can with our own skills in the name of something. And I think as a practice, that's what I try and craft, which is why I have a very discursive practice, right? Like talking and writing and being with people is very important to be, and my work. And also when my work's shown, it's important to have discussion and, you know, acts that are around it and within it. So in a more militant sense, I would have another response to this, like, because that was all kind of nice. Like, oh, we'll try really hard and make aggregations of communities that can do something in the world. But in a more militant sense, I fully acknowledge that when my work is exhibited in, I don't know, like when I show at the Tate or something, right? You know, you're going to have to understand that the audience that is seeing your work, and I mean when I talk about audience, I don't just mean like some Joe Public kind of version of an audience, but I'm talking about the educated art audience, the art makers, the curators, the kind of bureaucracy of art, will often not want to read the work in the way, like they struggle because they're like, the work doesn't fit with their expectations of how it should be read off as like other artworks. And it won't fit in to something that they'd like it to fit with. And therefore it's difficult for them to accept. And so in a way, there's a real difficulty, just a very pragmatic difficulty in working with the world of art because of its normative expectations about what critique looks like and is and should be. So it creates silos because it forces one to like only work with people who already share that language, right? So it's really important for me to try and like, that's the kind of, in a way, the struggle, but also the good thing about being in the art world is that you're constantly working with kind of discourse enemies, right? Whereas when I do kind of talks, my philosophy, it's kind of often more situated in the shared language of an interpretive community that's already agreed upon its space of reasons. So it's kind of like we're talking around the same purposes and often the same political goals and just disagreeing about like small things. But I think the art world offers this really different antagonism for me that needs to happen. And I think that is the intervention that's actually required, even though it might just be in the petty bourgeois world of art. Like I said at the beginning, it might seem to be nothing, but it's actually a part of the propaganda machine of capitalist culture.
Thank you, Amanda. One, I hope, simple question, which is about your use of the term picturing. I may be making all this up, but if your answer may have interesting implications for art and Marxism, I think. Are you using it as the Salarzian picturing and hence putting it somewhere in at the entrance of the transcendental apparatus? And thus, your use of picturing suggests putting this outside, putting picturing. Are you proposing picturing as something in the public space? This is my question.
There's so many kind of ways I could think this. I'll try and just answer it in a very, maybe more standard, like practical way. In the sense that one of the things I'm very, I've been advocating for, let's say, or arguing for, is representation. And when I say representation, I don't mean classical forms of metaphysics and mind-world relations, but in the kind of history, recent history of art, like say the last half of the 20th century, especially with like affect theory and phenomenology, there's been a strong advocacy of anti-representationalism, right? Because the idea of representing is very much associated with problematic forms of mastery, therefore, ergo colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and then on the other hand, it's associated with forms of just producing false consciousness, right? So I'm really interested in how we can produce like adequations, let's say, in terms of realism that are not just ironic forms of false consciousness that we might see in Althusser's reading of, say, modern realism. Just to be clear that, his idea of modern realism is a piece of literature and artwork that copies the world, like literally here's a painting of some chairs and whatnot, and through the mimetic pathology of the mind-world process, the viewer sees the artwork and in comparing it to the reality they live in, acknowledges the finitude of or of capital and the illusion that they live in. So I'm saying that that kind of representation is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, when I say picturing, I'm thinking of a modality of representation that demands transcendental acts, like i.e. arguments about something. That's what I mean by that, like transcendental arguments or statements, but also that it's a materialism that can fully well have to explicate its implicit conditions, which is what I've been talking about, these inferential conditions. And one of the modes of representation that I'm thinking about is the way in which multiple dialectical operations are occurring at the same time, and can be tracked in different temporalities as well. So rather than say, for example, in that, Althusser's critique of Hegel, which is like the consistency of reason over history, I would see that the transcendental materialist attitude would more be like, well, we're all kind of thinking because we're like thinking like base consciousness, but we deploy the labor of thought at certain points that gives it a kind of specific temporality. And I think in an artwork, they can be kind of spoken to, whether it's a time-based work, like a piece of music or a video or a painting even. I think this time-space kind of condition, or this picturing of the multiplicity of dialectical operations, can be thought through without kind of totalizing it in some kind of kitsch. So maybe that doesn't answer your question in terms of the sellers, but it's certainly, you're making me think about what is the act of making pictures in terms of, and the capacities of representation that don't fall into the problems of theology or kitsch as well.
Just a quick follow-up on what you just said. It seemed to me rather interesting. I just want to ask you, so why not talking of imagination or creation to describe this sort of picturing activity? Would you be against these words? Thank you.
I actually have been running a research group for many years, but the theme for the past 2 years has been artistic image, scientific imagination. So I'm not opposed to this word, but I have to preface it with the word scientific or rationalist, because we understand that it could easily be prefixed with the word capitalist, which is the dominant form of the imagination, if we think about Althusser's view of ideology. So what is something other than that within the bounds of the given that is capital that we live within? And what resources and tools can we use to think such a rationalist imaginary? I don't mind those words as such, but they have the tendency to index some kind of coming from nowhere. And I understand, I know Reza, the nowhereness that he's interested in, and but I also, like to understand very much how we're always inside a material situation, and it's Althusser's description of those Alfa Romeo workers that always fascinates me in that text, and that the impossibility is a question that comes from the impossibility that is the kind of demand of the imaginary, let's say, and also the act of the imaginary in the same condition, is emerging from also the empirical conditions. So yes, it's bounded, but it's also not at the same time. And I know that this sounds like I'm doing this Hegelian reading of Althusser, everyone, and which Althusser would go, oh, no, but I'm doing that. Okay, I'm kind of putting Hegel a bit back in there because I think it's going to be there anyway, kind of thing. So it's more like I'm going, okay, let's do Hegel in Althusser, which might not be so popular.
It might be something that artists talk about a lot, but I'd never really thought about sense in which sort of once you put an artwork out there, it's not being self-critical. Like I thought that was like a really interesting part of it, but I did think the thing while watching a film that I thought was interesting is that because the film obviously has like temporality, that there is a sense of like that it kind of intentionally breaks from earlier bits, and so it seems like something unique about that kind of modality where, so on the one hand that you could have like a spirit of trust type of magnanimous recollection going on, and then you can also have those kind of splits, right?
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. The luxury of art, you know, is that we get to model out these worlds, and also actually rehearse their destruction, play in the model world, and test out possibilities. But also, to some extent, one can, like, this sounds so weird that I'm saying this, because people will be really shocked, I think, to hear me say this, but you can, like, have these intuitive moments. But then as soon as you've done them, you go back the next day and you listen to the music you've written, or you see the mark you've made, and you go, okay, well, you first of all understand where it came from, right? You know the causes you understand the causes that led to that sound making or mark making or even writing. And then you start to work with that as material. So it's like never left alone, the retreatment. And so I think you're precisely right that there is a luxury in the affordance to say, like, here's, like, in many of the works I make, like, I deliberately put in things in the work that I really hate, like really disagree with, just to play out the conditions, and then that allow me to create like a kind of space of antagonism to see what happens in a way, but also in a world that I'm actually controlling as well, but acknowledge, of course, that I'm not, right? Because, as we say, it's an incomplete project, the very act of thought. So yes, it's precisely, that's the luxury that I have to do this in, because it is a fictional space. But it's also, well, what then is the fiction of the political that is being produced ultimately from that fictionalizing? And how then, as the question that you're asking, Sean, does that intervene at all, if anything? How does it contribute to reformulate or even propose new norms that could actually have any traction at all in the world, right? When often, as I've said in my paper, nah, you know, just subsumed. So what is it to play with that? It's super important, and I honestly don't know the answer, but that's the practice, right? To try. Yeah.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question about coming back to this division, or the first statement that you made, that you had a practice that is really divided up into the production of theory, or on a discursive level, production of thought that you need also for your own practice, and to keep that distinct from your art practice, or what you nominate as to be art. Still, as I watch your presentation, I see a very lively performance that very much informs the artwork. That becomes, although you mentioned you didn't want to instruct the people in how you phrase your theory to read into the artwork, it still does. So it becomes enriched, and it becomes even for me more legible to read your artworks. So I was provoked by this clear insistence by you on keeping the separation intact. In the art world now, there is a lot of, you also mentioned this popularity of hybridity or of transdisciplinarity. Performance lectures, or the essay, documentation, artwork. For me, still, it's quite more obvious, and it becomes also more scientific, the way you, as a practitioner, operate and have this distinction of being this theorist and this art maker. what is your purpose for this separation? Is this a deliberate strategic positioning of yourself as a practitioner, or?
Well, thank you for that, Jack. It is really important, but part of the answer could be that the world we live in produces that. Just the necessity of like I can't show my artwork here. Right? There's no way that could happen. There's no facilities, there's no rooms, there's no money, there's no support, and that's not anyone's fault, but it's the condition of the culture, right? So the cultural condition is to separate these things. So I'm subjugated by that situation. At the same time, in terms of the last question, precisely, I have no interest in really spending time rehearsing arguments that I really don't agree with. Like, what's the point? It's like wasting my time, Like, I'm not going to write a paper, there's so many people I disagree with, but I can't pick anyone. There's so many people. But I'm going to, my papers are like pragmatic attempts to move forward somewhere, right? Whereas the artwork has the affordance to acknowledge things that really work through some of the vectors of capitalism in a more affectual, immersed way, which I wouldn't perform out for you in this paper. So in that sense, I'll consider my artwork to be dogmatic, didactic, but not in the ways that people might assume those things to take place, right? So just like Althusser might think about Cremonini as an educational experience to produce the negation of the abolition of capital, I don't think I'm doing that, but I do think it has an educational kind of condition, and so when people see my artwork, and invigilators might say when I'm showing my work, what we're supposed to tell the audience when they come in and go, what we're supposed to say to the audience, and I say, well, that doesn't matter, because there's no, you can't read off the work and go, oh, this means this means that equals this, which is what Althusser does to Cremonini. It's that is the problem, I think, with the reading, but also the problem of the work, even though I actually quite like Cremonini, actually, but it's the problem of the work's construction if it allows that to happen. So it's Althusser's fault and it's Cremonini's. It's not just one over-determining the other. So I'm like, well, how does one kind of play in the complexity of this problem of reality and the real without... whilst producing the capacity to think through the complexity, but without reducing it into some totalized reading. So, and I think in many ways, my papers kind of do that as well, because whilst I'm trying to say, this is what I think, my papers, as you probably heard, don't end up with this this is it. This is the artwork that everyone should be making. This is how everyone should be. I think I'd like to think this is how everyone should think about thinking or think about art, but there's no doctrine for everyone should make art that looks like this or something like that. So I think for me it's really important to keep the divides are actually helpful, and just because, as I said, that I'm not providing an explication of how one might illustrate the other or whatever, it's not because I'm going, oh, it's up to you, I'm really interested in the open artwork. I'm not. I'm not interested in openness at all. I think that we should be trying to say things, but it's just that even saying what we think is about the production of complexity in itself. It's not just here's an answer, and that's what Althusser, I think, is really useful for.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciated what you were saying a minute ago about this sort of the repetition across day-to-day diachronic time of returning to the act, and I think it's a nice way to not fall into this sort of vulgar romanticism of this lightning strike eureka moment, but and that this is the act of sort of rationalist imagination, as you were saying, or something. I'm just curious to hear, would you say that one is returning to the same act? The act is carrying itself out across however long it takes you to complete the work. And when you're in the act of the work, are you day to day returning to the same act? Would you articulate it that way? Or is it a different picture with this sort of dissonance between knowing and doing?
I think it's a really fascinating question, and it's actually really hard to answer, because on the one hand, your question is making me think of like a methodological proposition, and on the other hand, you're making me think of like actual experience. You know, like what is it? And I think just for your question, Kirill, like I keep going back to your question because it's really helpful in a way, because what it allows me to think about is just simply these modes of where you go, okay, this happened, I need to treat that. I need to critique that as like a target vocabulary rather than as something that I even produced, you know. And you have the capacity to produce this relationship to things that you have done as objects in the world. And I think that kind of, these vectors of alienation, let's say, are extremely constructive and helpful. And so on the one hand, there are these breaks, as you might refer to them, but on the other hand, they can be kind of encapsulated within a kind of methodological abstraction, as I would call it. They can be housed within an explanation. They don't refute an explanation either. It's just that the explanation is one that includes them. So yeah, the explanation includes inconsistencies.